Hi everybody, I'm Brendan Stewart. I work with ERA Architects. I'm a landscape architect and an urban designer. It's a real privilege to be here today. This is a really important topic, and it's an honor to be part of such an esteemed group of speakers. And obviously, looking at the audience, there's a lot of extremely knowledgeable and experienced people in the room. So I think this is going to be a great day. I'm going to make this really quick. I know we're really sticking to a quick timeline so we can get into discussion mode. This is a huge topic and it's a bit difficult to talk about in 15 minutes. I'm going to really focus on some ideas about the application of this concept. I think that there's so much theory behind it, and there's so many important ideas. We have policy frameworks that we're going to be talking about. I'm interested in talking a little bit as a practitioner who's been grappling with the concept and the identification, the evaluation, and ideally the thinking about how places continue to evolve. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the context of Toronto. So I'm going to try to scratch the surface of these questions. What are they and why are they important? So when it comes to what are cultural heritage landscapes, I think one of the underlying things that we need to really be grappling with, and I think Julian started to talk about this, or talked about this quite well. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Maybe it's more for the recording. Thanks, Jane. Is this question of are they places? Can we define them? Do they have boundaries? How do we think about that? Is it actually in some cases more of an approach to understanding what's important about a place, an approach to working with communities and people and having them inform a process about what's important, and also thinking about the future and ideas about citizenship and stewardship and what that means in terms of a real focus on that relationship between the artifact and sort of the ritual and the connection that we have. I think also one of the struggles is when we start to think about significance and thinking about a hierarchy. If we have particular places that are maybe easier to identify and are more important, I think aspirationally, when we're thinking about the future of the city, when we're thinking about city building, when we're thinking about the type of world we want to live in, these types of ideas and this idea that having a rich connection between communities and people and places, shouldn't that be something that we're thinking about in all of the work we do, in all of the places in between, in the entirety of the public realm? And in particular, when we're living in a city that's only getting more complex and dense, how do we think about that? And I think in some ways it's a great aspirational idea, especially when we think about the process of how we get there and how we think about applying these concepts. These are slides of a project that we worked on with Public Work, the landscape architects in Toronto, mouth of the Creek Park. This is a site that some of you might know about. It's a National Historic Site. It's part of the Fort York National Historic Site. And I'm not going to talk a lot about it. There's not time, but I think it's an example where we, as a group of experts and a group of stakeholders, and then through a public engagement process, went through quite an approach. I think that was derived from cultural landscape thinking about identifying maybe what it is about this place, which is at the moment highly disturbed and has undergone numerous eras of evolution, with really nothing tangible still there, but a number of important associations. How do we go through a process to bring back and develop a sort of united idea about what it could be? So obviously one subset is this idea of significant works of design, and this is maybe more the old paradigm of thinking about architectural built heritage and the idea of monuments and sort of artifacts. And I think there's nobody would dispute. Maybe some people would, but I think Nathan Phillips Square is a great example in the city, and it's something that's been recently very very carefully and lovingly brought back to life and rejuvenated, a significant work of design as one of the subsets of how we look at and identify cultural heritage landscapes. I just wanted to point out that a lot of thinking has been done in the city locally about starting to identify and starting to understand the history of I guess, the practice of landscape architecture and significant works of landscape architecture in the city and the legacy of those designers and thinkers and practitioners. There's a book that was created last year as part of a conference that happened that the Cultural Landscape Foundation organized in May of 2015, and also a website which is a sort of a living document where a lot of that material has been gathered, information about people and places, and the significance of those places, and when we're then going to intervene with them in the future, as we inevitably will, how do we understand what the ideas embedded in them are, and how do we make responsible decisions, like the example of Nickham Hill Square. I think another sort of component part of applying some of this thinking to our landscapes in the city, in my experience, is we're often working, whether these sites are identified already as cultural heritage landscapes. They certainly are, for the most part, any landscape we're working on downtown has, of course, evolved a number of times in most cases. And a characteristic, I think, of these landscapes tends to be that there are these numerous layers, and oftentimes evidence and physical patterns that reflect some of those layers of history are things that we should be carefully understanding and working with, and trying to understand the value of those things and how they add maybe some of the character of these places that people value and that inform the relationship people have to these places. Another example, Guild Park, a wonderful site in Scarborough that has, again, is another example of multiple fascinating eras of change and development and the accumulation of those layers on the site. This is showing the site back when it was essentially an estate landscape before it became the Guild of All Arts, and certainly before it became a place where some of the ruins of Toronto buildings are collected in a sculpture garden, and certainly before it became a public park. But understanding all of those patterns becomes a big part of how we might think about it, and understanding that these are complex places that have evolved. I think another important characteristic, of course, is the sort of association that some of our places have with our history and some of the really important stories and people and events, in addition to the important sort of daily pieces. So this is an image of the Fort York site, and again the Creek Park site that I talked about earlier. So here, we have incredibly strong narratives and ideas that are fundamentally important, I think, to for people, for the citizens of our city to know about the origin. In this case, a lot of these stories are only going back to the sort of the colonial period. Obviously, the site carries meaning well beyond that, back in time. But in terms of the founding of the city, this site really is the place that the idea of the city here is tied to. And so we have that sort of associative value tied to a lot of these sites. I think another point that I've encountered time and again in my own practice is the idea that in most cases where we have these significant sites, they tend to have been developed and settled because, in a lot of cases, because of the sort of natural features that they have, or the opportunities that some of those natural and ecological systems provided. So again, going back to the Guild Park site, what's interesting to me about the site here is, when it was settled as an estate and through all of its layers of evolution, the connection of the site to the lake and to the bluffs was fundamentally important to understanding why that place exists. But when we look at it today, and as we look at how that view has evolved over time, I mean, you can easily go there and not know that you're on the lake. And so how do we start thinking about balancing, in practice, cultural value and sort of natural values? And how do we get away from the silos of jurisdiction and the lack of engagement, and bridging, recognizing that these two things are not mutually exclusive, and how do we, I think views become a really interesting place where that comes into play. And so I guess this is my plug for saying that, as we think about Guild Park, I think there is a cultural view there that we need to be cultivating, and we need to be thinking about that. And obviously there's a lot of ecological value to the vegetation that happens at the edge of that view, but I think there's a balance that we could be striking. Obviously, we've talked about Kensington Market. It's such a fantastic example in the city of one of these places where that connection, as Julian says, between sort of artifact and ritual is perhaps at its richest. And so, of course, that fundamental focus on use and on ritual and on how the relationship, that places define, or that define these places between communities and the landscape itself is fundamentally important. I think it's also important to point out that, you know, we live in a city that is undergoing massive investment, and that pressure is very real and it's quite unique. And reinvention and intervention within these places is a big part of the conversation. We're often talking about contemplated change. We're talking about densification. We're talking about these places in the context of change, and that's a good thing, I think. You know, that's the nature of landscapes, is that they do evolve, they do change, and reestablishing and using that opportunity to enrich the relationship that we have to those places is a huge opportunity. And I think we have some great examples, you know, where understanding the unique quality of a place through a new intervention is actually doing just that. Of course, the brickworks, I think, is another fantastic example. So quickly getting into why are they important. The yellow is pretty hard to read, I'm seeing here. So I think there's a couple of just key themes that I would want to promote for discussion. So first of all, you know, this idea of using this as a tool and as a way of approaching the city with the ambition of enhancing our sense of place and our sense of rootedness in our place. Those are you know, not new ideas. They're really important ideas. It's hard to define those ideas, but we obviously live in a very globalized world. It's a very transient world. Every opportunity we have to create particularity, I think, and to create unique places that have really, really deep bonds is a very healthy thing for us to be thinking about as a society. I think secondly is really just understanding, and this gets back into the notion, I think, of the aspirational aspect. That our values, you know, shape our landscape, and our landscape shape our values. And so recognizing that anytime we act in the physical environment, every time we intervene and we make places, those places are gonna inform what we become. They represent our best, the best of ourselves or the worst of ourselves in terms of our relationship with each other and our relationship with the environment. And I guess the last piece is, I'll get to it. I mean, I have a few more slides, so I'll come back to that last one. This is a quote that I really love from John Van Nostrand that gets at this idea of sense of place and rootedness, you know, in our own region. If Toronto can embrace the natural landscape on which it sits and that it has so long ignored, it will take an enormous step toward becoming a culturally independent city. It will emerge as a city defined by its place. I think that this is a fundamentally important lesson, and I think a lot of people would agree with this. And I think that we are actually turning this corner and re-engaging with our ravines and re-engaging with the natural systems that define us. But I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind. And the relationship between, you know, our place and our culture and the health of our culture, I think, is the message. I think, again, in terms of this pattern of telling our stories and understanding where we come from, you know, there's multiple ways that can happen. It can happen at the smaller scale of interpretation and of communicating the narratives associated with places. And again, going back to Guild Park, to keep it tight, is one of those amazing sites. Just like I think the brickworks, where, you know, you have this one site that can tell the story of so many parts of the city. I think the same thing is true here, where you have these artifacts that talk about different parts of the city. The geographical reach of that landscape is so rich for interpretation. This notion, again, of our values shaping our landscapes and our landscape shaping our values. You know, what type of experiences do we want our children to be having? How does that inform the you know, the type of people they become, the type of society that we're trying to create? I think that happens at multiple scales. I think, again, going back to making Phillips Square, making sure we have these places where we can undertake these really important cultural rituals. This is, for those of you who were around when Jack Layton passed away, the amazing sort of impromptu pilgrimage that a lot of people made to mourn collectively. Having places where that can happen is so fundamentally important. I mean, we didn't have a site like this until the 1960s. We didn't have a plaza. And then, you know, another aspect of this is this idea, again, of fostering a culture of stewardship. And how do we do that? Through the process of making new places, of intervening in places, but also through walking tours and public education and all of these different activities that we engage in. On sites that also are, I would argue, cultural landscapes, but maybe aren't going to find their way into being identified as such, but working in every community that we work in, how does that process and that approach to understanding what's important inform how places evolve, and how do we do that with the communities who live in them? That's some of our work in the inner suburbs. This last point is just to put a really fine point on it. We live in a city, and this is a city that is growing denser and denser every day. The importance of every square inch of public realm only gets more so as that happens. And I think we need to be thinking about every square inch of the city in a very sophisticated way. And I think we need to be thinking about the performance of the landscape, both ecologically and culturally. And we need to make sure that it's, as an aspiration, it's doing, it's getting to that perfect balance of the connection between the artifact and the ritual. The idea that it's doing things that make us better and that teach us about our place and that bring us together as a people. I'll leave this last slide. I think I've done my 15 minutes, so I'm going to leave it here. But this is some analysis we've done in the office that just tries to understand the moment that we're currently at right now in the city, in terms of how much we've grown and the pace at which we've grown, and the relationship between that growth and sort of when we've started to think about the public realm in a very thoughtful way in comparison to some of the other cities that we often compare ourselves to. And I think the thesis here is that we're kind of at this really unique moment right now, and I think a lot of people would agree that we're maybe going through a bit of a renaissance and rediscovery in terms of how we think about cultural landscapes and how we think about the city and the public realm. And a lot of really good thinking is starting to happen. And I think it's happening because we have very serious issues to deal with right now, and a lot of pressure that is maybe unprecedented in our history. Thanks, I'll leave it there.